You know that feeling when your whole world changes in an instant? When something happens that you can't unsee, can't unhear, can't unfeel no matter how hard you try. I've lived most of my life trying to be the bigger person, the one who takes things in stride, who doesn't make a fuss or hold grudges. I thought I was good at it. I thought I understood how to let things roll off my back, how to keep my mouth shut when it would have been easier to say what I really felt. I've raised a daughter, built a career, maintained relationships through compromise and patience. But there are moments in life that test every ounce of composure you've built up over decades. Moments that make you question whether being the bigger person was ever really worth it, whether all that restraint and patience just makes you a doormat instead of a dignified person. This is the story of one of those moments. It's about a dinner, a family gathering, humiliation that I thought I'd have to just accept and move forward from like I've always done. A moment where I was literally knocked to the floor by my son-in-law, while my daughter laughed at me, told me I deserved it. But what I didn't know then was that one phone call would change everything. One single phone call would turn the tables completely, would shift the balance of power in a way that none of them saw coming, would make them understand that they'd made a terrible mistake underestimating me. Before I tell you what happened after that call, I need to show you what led to it. The months of build-up, the slow erosion of dignity, the way a family can turn on you when they believe a lie, when they decide you're the enemy without giving you a chance to defend yourself. This isn't a pretty story. It's messy and complicated and filled with moments that I'm not exactly proud of. But it's true. Every word of it. And sometimes the truth is the only currency that matters, the only thing that can set things right when everything else has fallen apart. I can still see it perfectly. The way my son-in-law's foot came out from under the dining room table, connecting with my ankle as I was walking past. The casual way he did it, like it was some kind of joke, some light-hearted prank at a family dinner. I went down hard, my arms flailing as I tried to catch myself on the edge of the table, knocking over a wine glass in the process. The red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like blood, spreading in all directions. My knee hit the hardwood floor first, then my hip, and I felt that sharp, immediate pain that comes with a fall. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. There was this frozen instant when nobody moved, nobody spoke, and then my daughter laughed. Not a concerned laugh, not the sound of someone worried about their parent. It was a mean laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere ugly, somewhere deep. She looked right at me, sprawled on the floor, and she said, "That's what you deserve." I remember staring up at her face, trying to process what I'd just heard, trying to understand how my own daughter could look at me like that and say those words with such confidence, such cruelty. Around the table, her husband's family joined in, their laughter filling the dining room like poison gas. His mother said something about me being clumsy, about how it was probably good for me to be knocked down a peg or two. His father smirked into his plate, finding great satisfaction in my pain. Even the cousins, people I'd known for years, were grinning like this was the funniest thing they'd seen all week, like they'd been waiting for something like this all along. I got up slowly, brushing myself off, trying to maintain some dignity even though my knee was bleeding and my ego was shatter, ed into pieces on that hardwood floor. Nobody helped me up. Nobody asked if I was okay. They just kept eating, kept laughing, kept acting like I was the entertainment for the evening, like I was a performing monkey who'd just done a trick for their amusement. This wasn't the beginning, though. This dinner was months into something that had been building like a storm on the horizon. Things had changed. The family dynamic that I thought was solid had cracked, and nobody bothered to tell me why. Looking back now, I can see the moment everything shifted. The moment when the story they were all telling about me became the only story that mattered. My name is David Winters. I'm in my mid-40s, divorced twice, which I'll admit isn't the proudest resume when it comes to relationships. But I've always been a provider, a protector, someone who believed that if you worked hard enough and made enough money, you could solve people's problems and make them happy. I worked my way up in commercial real estate starting from nothing, built a solid career, made really good money. I'm talking 6 figures good, The kind of money that lets you buy nice things, help your family, live comfortably. I invested in my daughter's education, made sure she went to the best schools, paid for her college completely without any student debt. When she needed help with down payments or medical bills or anything else, I was there immediately, no questions asked. I've never been someone who ran from responsibility. I tried to be present, even when I wasn't always present in the way that mattered most. I've made mistakes in my marriages, sure. Both of them had ended because I was too focused on work, too caught up in climbing the ladder, not paying enough attention to the people who needed me most. Too many late nights at the office, too many missed dinners and school events and anniversaries, too much ambition and not enough presence. I learned from those failures, or at least I thought I did. I modified my behaviour, I was more available, more attentive. With my daughter Sarah, I tried to be the father I hadn't always been, the one who shows up, who listens, who puts family first. Or at least that's what I told myself I was doing. I'd spent decades as building a reputation as a man of my word, someone you could trust, someone who delivered. My colleagues respected me. My business partners knew I was reliable. I was the guy people called when they needed something done. I had presence. I had authority. I had power in my professional life. But respect in the boardroom doesn't automatically translate to respect at home. That's something I wouldn't fully understand until much later, until it was too late to fix it the way I tried to fix everything else. Sarah had married Tom 7 years ago. They met in college, fell in love the way young people do, fast and hard and certain. I'd liked Tom well enough at first. He came from money, his family owned several business ventures. He seemed stable and ambitious in the way that people my age respected. He made good money, treated Sarah well in the beginning, gave her what looked like security. When they told me they were getting married, I was happy. I threw them an engagement party. I gave them a generous check for their honeymoon. I played the role of proud father. In those early years, Tom and I had gotten along fine. We'd go to football games together. We'd talk about business deals and investments. We'd have that easy camaraderie that men sometimes develop without really knowing each other, equally. His family seemed nice enough at first, if a little reserved. His mother Patricia was the kind of woman who smiled while keeping you at arm's length. His father Robert was old money, the type who'd inherited his success rather than built it, and that gave him a certain confidence that bordered on arrogance. But I didn't dislike them. I just didn't know them that well. Then things changed in subtle ways that I didn't notice until it was too late. The invitations to family events became less frequent. When I called Tom to make plans, he was always busy. Sarah started having excuses when I asked to visit. The relationship that I'd thought was solid had developed cracks. Sarah seemed stressed, always seemed anxious when I called. She started making excuses not to visit, not to have family dinners. When I pressed for details, she got defensive and told me it was nothing, just the normal ups and downs of married life. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. I didn't want to think that my daughter was unhappy. I didn't want to be the father who had to choose sides in a marriage, who had to deal with the fallout of another relationship failure in my family. So I let it go. I gave her space. I told myself that she was an adult and could handle her own problems. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was a Saturday in March, and Sarah had invited me over for what she said would be a casual family meal. Nothing fancy, just dinner, she said. I remember thinking that was a bit odd, because she usually made a point of these gatherings being special, and casual doesn't usually require an invitation that formal. But I didn't think too much about it. I just figured she wanted to spend time with me. When I arrived at their house, I found her in the kitchen, looking exhausted and nervous in a way that immediately put me on edge. Tom was already in the living room with his parents, who I hadn't seen in months. His mother, Patricia, had this expression on her face like she was sitting on some juicy piece of gossip, like she couldn't wait to say some thing. His father, Robert, was studying me with an intensity that felt uncomfortable, like he was appraising me the way you'd appraise a used car you were thinking about buying. Sarah kept her eyes down, avoiding mine. She'd already chosen her side, I realised. even before the conversation had started. "Come sit," his mother had said, patting the chair next to her. "Let's talk about what's really been going on." That's when the accusations started. They came fast and furious, one after another, like an avalanche that had been waiting at the top of a mountain just for the right moment to let loose. Tom's family claimed I'd made inappropriate comments about Tom, that I'd undermined him professionally, that I'd interfered in their marriage by taking Sarah's side in disagreements they didn't even know I knew about. Sarah sat there, silent, and with that silence, she confirmed every accusation. She looked at me with something between betrayal and relief, like she'd been waiting for someone else to say these things so she didn't have to shoulder the burden alone. I tried to defend myself, to explain that I'd never done any of those things, that I'd been nothing but supportive of their marriage. But my words fell flat in that room. Tom had a narrative all prepared, and he was sticking to it like it was gospel truth. He talked about how I'd called him after a business deal fell through and suggested he wasn't cut out for entrepreneurship, that maybe he should consider a different career path. He talked about how I'd told Sarah I didn't think he was ambitious enough for her, that she was as settling. He talked about how I'd subtly criticised his family's business practices at various dinners and gatherings, making snide comments about their lack of sophistication or vision. Some of these things were misrepresentations of conversations that had happened, taken out of context and twisted into something ugly. Some of them were pure fabrication. I'd spent my career learning how to read people, how to spot when someone was lying, and I could see it in Tom's face as he spoke. He believed the lies he was telling, or at least he'd convinced himself they were close enough to truth that they might as well be. But the damage was done. Sarah had chosen to believe them. I'd realised then that I'd been voted out, exiled from the inner circle of my daughter's life. The rest of that dinner was a blur of accusations and denials, of my voice getting louder and more desperate as I realised no one was listening. By the time dessert came around, the decision had been made. I was the problem. I was the one who'd caused Sarah's unhappiness. I was the one who'd corrupted her loyalty to her husband. I needed to back off, they said. I needed to respect boundaries. I needed to stop trying to control Sarah's life. And when I objected, when I tried to point out that I'd never done any of the things they were accusing me of, Tom's father had smiled at me like I was a child who didn't understand the rules of the game. He actually said, "You know, David, sometimes successful men like you have a hard time accepting that their way isn't always the right way. Maybe you should think about that." His tone was patronising, the way you'd talk to someone who was mentally slow. I felt my face flush with anger and humiliation in equal measure. The worst part was that I couldn't prove them wrong. How do you defend yourself against accusations that are vague enough to be impossible to directly refute? How do you explain that you never said certain things when they're painting a picture, rather than recounting specific incidents? I left that dinner feeling hollowed out, like someone had reached into my chest and pulled out the parts of me that mattered most. I called Sarah 3 times that night. She didn't pick up. I sent emails trying to explain, trying to set the record straight. She responded with short, cold messages that made it clear the conversation was over. One message just said, "I need space right now, Dad. Please respect that." I did respect it. I gave her space, lots of it. I backed away from her life completely, didn't call, didn't text, didn't try to arrange visits. Then the monthly dinners stopped being monthly. Then the occasional phone calls became texts. Then the texts became hours without responses. Sarah was pulling away from me slowly and methodically, like someone backing out of a room without turning around. I told myself it was a phase, that they were working through something and I needed to give them space to work it out. I didn't realise I was being systematically cut out of my daughter's life, didn't understand that Tom's family had decided I was the enemy, and that Sarah had decided to take their side. I spent months trying to reach out in subtle ways, trying to repair the damage without appearing desperate, trying to find some way to prove that I wasn't the villain they'd painted me as. I sent birthday gifts. They were acknowledged with texts. I sent holiday cards. No response. I even had flowers delivered with a note saying I loved her. She sent a brief thank you message that felt like ice. I was being slowly erased from her life, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Then came the night my daughter laughed when I fell down. The fall happened during what was supposed to be a reconciliation dinner. Sarah had texted me the day before saying she wanted to move past the tension between us, that she missed me. I'd felt a surge of relief and hope when I read that message. I thought maybe I was being let back in, maybe the worst was over. I put on nice clothes, brought a bottle of her favourite wine, drove across town full of tentative optimism. The house smelled like Sarah's cooking, the same recipes her mother used to make before the divorce. I let myself believe that this meant something good was coming. We sat down at the table, and everything seemed normal for about 10 minutes. We talked about work, about the weather, about nothing of importance. The conversation was stilted and awkward, but it felt like a beginning. And then Tom asked me to pass the salad. It was a simple request, a normal dinner action. But as I stood up to lean across and grab the bowl, his foot came out from under the table. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate movement, designed to trip me. I stumbled forward, my hands reaching out to catch myself. I knocked over the wine glass, my knee hit the hardwood floor, and I fell like I was made of glass. My knee split open on the edge of the table. Blood ran down my leg into my sock, and then Sarah laughed. Not just a small laugh, but real laughter, the kind that came from deep in her belly. Tom joined in, and then his mother started, and then his father. They were all laughing at me, at the pain, at the spectacle of their patriarch on the floor. I lay there, or what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. I pushed myself up, one hand pressed to my bleeding knee, and I looked at my daughter's face. The laughter was dying down, but the meanness was still there, still visible in her eyes. "That's what you deserve," she said. And I understood in that moment that I was no longer her father. I was just a man on a floor that she and her husband had decided to humiliate. I don't think I've ever felt more alone than I did getting up from that floor. The pain in my knee was nothing compared to the pain of seeing my daughter's face contorted with cruel laughter. The pain of realizing that the person I'd raised, the person I'd given everything to, had turned against me so completely that she could watch her husband attack me and find it funny. I went to the bathroom and cleaned up the blood, wrapped a towel around my knee to stop the bleeding. When I came back out, they were still eating like nothing had happened, like I hadn't fallen, like my daughter hadn't just told me I deserved to be hurt. Tom was recounting the moment to his parents like it was the funniest thing that had ever happened. He was exaggerating my stumble, mimicking the way I'd flailed my arm, and they were all laughing again. Sarah didn't participate in the retelling, but she didn't object either. She just kept eating, her eyes down on her plate like she was pretending it hadn't happened. I sat back down slowly, my knee throbbing, and tried to eat some salad. My throat felt tight. My hands were shaking. I wanted to stand up and leave, to walk out of that house and never come back, but I didn't. I sat there like a coward and I finished that meal. I smiled when they made jokes. I laughed at their stories. I played the role of the good-natured father who could take a joke, who wasn't so fragile that he couldn't handle a little family ribbing. But inside, I was breaking. Something inside me cracked that night. The part of me that had always tried to make things work, that had always been willing to bend and accommodate and forgive, that part of me started to calcify, started to harden into something else. After dinner, I drove home in silence. My knee was swollen by the time I got there, the skin around it turning an ugly shade of purple. I sat in my living room with an ice pack and I tried to figure out what the hell had happened to my life. How had I gone from being a man who provided, who showed up, who did the right thing, to being someone's punchline? How had my daughter learned to be so cruel? The answer wasn't hard to find. She had learned it from her husband. Tom had shown her that it was okay to look down on me, okay to laugh at me, okay to treat me like I was less than human. And she'd believed him. She'd believed the narrative he'd fed her so completely that she was willing to participate in my humiliation. That night I made a decision. I was done trying to fix this. I was done overlaying. I was done being the big person while they trampled all over me. Something shifted inside me. Some fundamental belief about how I should conduct myself. I wasn't going to call Sarah anymore. I wasn't going to try to make this work, but I wasn't going to let this go either. Not anymore. The thing about humiliation is that it doesn't end with a single event. It echoes, it multiplies, it grows. In the weeks that followed that dinner, I started noticing things that I should have seen earlier, patterns that made it clear that I wasn't just being cut out of my daughter's life, I was being systematically destroyed. There were comments Sarah made when I did manage to get her on the phone. Little digs about my age, about my job, about my relationships. She'd reference things that Tom had apparently been saying about me, passing along his criticisms like they were gospel truth, like everything that came out of her husband's mouth was the voice of reason. My business partner mentioned running into Tom at a golf outing, and Tom had apparently spent the entire time complaining about how a controlling father I was, how I'd nearly ruined his marriage by constantly meddling and interfering. Word travels fast in circles like that. Pretty soon half the city seemed to know that I was the villain in my daughter's marriage. I'd run into former colleagues and see the pity in their eyes, that look that said they'd heard the stories. I'd hear through the grapevine that Tom was telling people I was mentally unstable, that I had narcissistic personality disorder, that I'd emotionally abused my daughter her entire life. None of it was true, but the damage was being done regardless. Every lie he told became another layer of protection between me and my daughter. Sarah started cancelling plans at the last minute. We'd schedule a lunch and she'd text an hour before saying Tom needed for something, or she wasn't feeling well, or she'd just forgotten. The message was clear without her having to spell it out. I wasn't important anymore. I wasn't worth her time. I wasn't worth the effort of a 15-minute phone call. And if I'd still been willing to be the bigger person, I might have accepted that as just how things were now, might have let it go and tried to move on with my life. But I wasn't willing anymore. I started keeping track of everything, every cancelled plan, every insult passed along from Tom, every moment of disrespect. I documented it all. I started saving the text messages. I recorded conversations where they made their accusations, making careful digital records of everything they said. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with this information yet, but I knew I was going to need it. I could feel something building inside me, something that had been building for years but had finally found its trigger. Something dark and patient and absolutely determined. I was done being the victim in this story. It was time to become something else. I started making calls, not big dramatic calls, not the kind where you pick up the phone and immediately say everything you're thinking, just small ones at first. I called Tom's company, asked to speak to his business partner about his investment practices. The woman who answered seemed confused at first, but when I explained I was interested in potentially investing, her tone changed completely. She mentioned some concerns about Tom's financial management, about missing funds from a joint account. Nothing definitive, just enough to make me think there was something there worth digging into. I hung up and I felt the smallest spark of something. Not quite hope. More like the beginning of a plan forming. The thing about humiliation is that it gives you clarity. When you're being respected, when you're still in the game, you're too busy maintaining your position to really think strategically. But when you're on the outside, when you've been knocked down and laughed at by your own family, you start to see things with perfect clarity. You start to notice patterns that were always there but you were too busy or too proud to see. I started going through my emails, pulling up every message Sarah had ever sent me about Tom, every complaint she'd ever made, every moment of doubt she'd expressed. There were more than I remembered. She'd told me things during our phone calls that she'd clearly already told him, and he'd twisted them somehow, made them about me being the problem. She'd mentioned his late nights, his evasiveness about money, his strange behaviour when she asked questions about their finances. She'd said things like, "I just don't know what's going on with him anymore, and I'm worried we're spending more than we're making." These weren't complaints about me. These were complaints about her husband. and I'd been so focused on thinking they were blaming me that I hadn't paid proper attention to what she was actually saying. I started keeping better records after that. I got a notebook and I wrote things down. Dates, times, conversations. The things Tom had said about me through Sarah. The way Sarah's voice had changed over the months from warm and connected to cold and distant. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being professional. I was approaching this the way I would approach any problem in my business. You gather information, you analyze it, you form a hypothesis, sis, and then you test that hypothesis against your data. 3 months passed, 3 months of Sarah cancelling plans, of Tom making snide comments about me through their friends, of watching my daughter slowly drift away like she was on a raft moving out to sea, and I was on the shore with no way to reach her. I missed her birthday, not because I forgot, because she told me not to come. She said it would be too complicated, that Tom had already made other plans, that it would be stressful. I sent a gift anyway. A piece of jewellery that her mother had owned, something Margaret had wanted Sarah to have when she was old enough to appreciate it. Sarah thanked me in a text message. 1 sentence. No emotion. No connection. I sat with that text message for 3 days, reading it over and over, trying to find something in it that wasn't cold rejection. Lausus wouldn't. During those 3 months, I went to a work dinner and someone asked me how Sarah was doing. The question hit me harder than it should have. I just said, she's good, keeping busy with Tom and his business ventures. The man smiled and said, that must be nice, having a daughter doing so well. What I heard underneath that was something different, though. I heard pity. I heard the understanding that something was wrong with my relationship with Sarah. I heard the implication that maybe I was the problem. I excused myself to the bathroom and I stood there looking at my face in the mirror, trying to recognize the man staring back at me. My eyes looked tired. My face looked older than it should have. I looked defeated. That's what kept happening over those 3 months. I kept seeing that reflection, kept seeing what this was doing to me. The weight was literally visible in my face. I was losing hair faster than usual from stress. I started having headaches that lasted all day. My sleep became erratic. I'd fall asleep on the couch by 8 o'clock, then wake up at 2 in the morning and lie there in the dark, replaying conversations, analysing everything Sarah had ever said to me, looking for the moment when I'd lost her. What struck me most wasn't any single event. It was the cumulative weight of all of it. It was the way small rejections added up, the way each cancelled dinner was another brick in a wall being built between us. It was the realisation that Sarah had made a decision about me, and no amount of trying was going to change it. She decided I was the villain, and she was sticking with that decision even though the evidence didn't support it, even though if she'd just talked to me I could have explained, could have defended myself. But she'd already decided not to listen. I think that's what finally broke something in me. Not the fall at dinner, not the laughter, not even Tom's cruelty. It was the moment I understood that my daughter didn't want to hear my side of the story. She'd already made up her mind, and nothing I could say would change that. She wasn't open to the truth. She was committed to the lie they'd constructed. And in that moment, something shifted. I stopped trying to prove myself innocent. I started trying to figure out what they were guilty of. There was a day when I realised I'd been crying without noticing it. I was at my desk, Kay at work going through financial documents, and I realised my vision was blurry. I touched my face and it was wet. I'd been sitting there, just crying silently, not even aware of it. That was when I knew things had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep getting knocked down and expecting it to eventually lead somewhere good. I had to do something. It took another 2 weeks before I found the first real evidence. I was having lunch with an old colleague, someone I'd done business with years ago, and he mentioned something in passing. He said his firm had done some work for Tom's company, preliminary work on a development deal, and they'd found some irregularities in the financial documentation. Nothing they could pursue legally, but enough that they decided to walk away from the project. My ears picked up immediately. Irregularities. That was a word that meant something. I leaned forward and said, "Tell me more about that." He hesitated, then he said, "Look, I probably shouldn't talk about this, but given that he's family, you should know. The numbers didn't make sense, the projections were too aggressive, the asset valuation seemed way off. There were some documentation issues that made us uncomfortable. My colleague didn't want to say more than that, but he gave me a name and contact information for someone at his firm who'd handled the actual documents. That phone call changed everything." I started asking careful questions, the kind that don't seem like you're digging but actually are. What kind of irregularities? Had there been anything fraudulent? Had anyone reported it? I didn't identify myself as Sarah's father. I just said I was interested in some due diligence on a company Tom was involved with, that I was considering an investment opportunity. The woman hesitated for a moment, then she said, "I'd be careful if I were you. The documentation we reviewed had some serious problems. There were inflated projections, as misrepresented assets, some documents that looked like they'd been altered. It wasn't enough for us to make an official complaint, but it was enough for us to want nothing to do with the guy." My heart started racing. I asked her if she'd be willing to talk to me more formally, maybe even provide some documentation. She said she couldn't, not without getting her firm's legal approval. But she did say this: if anyone else has been approached by Tom with similar investment opportunities, they should be very careful. And if anyone reports him, we probably have information that could be useful. I thanked her and I hung up and I sat in my office for a long time with the phone in my hand, just staring at nothing. What I had was the beginning of a picture. It wasn't complete yet, but it was getting there. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. Something focused and cold. I hired a private investigator. I know how that sounds, like something out of a movie, like I was being melodramatic. But I wasn't. I was being strategic. I did something I'd never done before. I made a list of questions that I needed answered. Is Tom committing fraud? How much money is he taking? How long has this been going on? Is my daughter aware of what he's doing? Who else is being hurt? These were professional questions, the kind of questions that don't have emotional weight attached to them. They're just facts you need to establish. I found a private investigator through a lawyer I knew. The woman's name was Carol, and she met with me in her office, a modest space in a downtown building that didn't look like much from the outside but was clearly professional. I told her the truth. My daughter's husband has been saying things about me that aren't true. I think he might be involved in financial fraud. I want to know what I'm actually dealing with. Carol looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Do you want me to find out if he's defrauding your daughter too?" "Yes," I said. "If he is, I definitely want to know that." She nodded and she said, "This is going to take some time and it's going to cost some money." "How much?" I asked. She quoted a number that made me wince, but I didn't hesitate. "Do it," I said. 2 weeks later, Carol came to my office with a thick folder. She sat down across from my desk and she said, "I think you need to see this." The folder felt heavy in my hands. What she showed me was damning in a way I hadn't quite expected. Tom had 3 business ventures, operating simultaneously. The company he told Sarah about, which was supposedly making millions, was actually barely breaking even and had been for the past 2 years. The investments he'd been soliciting from other people, including some that he'd approached my daughter about, weren't going to legitimate development projects. They were going into shell companies that he'd set up, companies that appeared on paper to be doing business, but weren't actually doing anything. There was evidence of commingling of funds, of money being moved from business accounts into personal accounts, of significant personal expenditures being disguised as business expenses, luxury watches, a boat, travel to Las Vegas and Atlantic City. He'd taken money from investors under false pretenses. He hadn't reported T to the IRS. There were tax documents that showed he'd filed false returns, claimed deductions that didn't exist, hidden income in offshore accounts, and there was more. There was always more. He had a gambling problem, a serious one. Casino records, credit card statements, online betting sites. Tom was losing tens of thousands of dollars a month gambling, and he was using his business as a way to try to cover the losses, to fund his addiction. He'd even taken loans against his company that he'd used to cover gambling debts, which he then couldn't repay. Carol looked at me across the desk and she said, "This man is in serious financial trouble. Serious enough that I'm surprised he hasn't been caught yet." "How much trouble?" I asked. She did the math for me. If his victims wanted to pursue criminal charges, he's probably looking at 10 to 15 years minimum. The fraud alone is substantial. The tax evasion adds another layer. The Ponzi scheme elements, because that's what this essentially is, makes it worse. My hands were shaking as I looked at the documentation spread out across my desk. My daughter had married a fraud. A man who was committing federal crimes. A man who was lying to her about everything. And he'd used her, or at least tried to use her, to help cover up his problems. He'd tried to manipulate me because I had money and he needed money. When I'd refused to be manipulated, he'd decided I was the problem. He'd convinced my daughter that I was the problem, and now they were laughing at me, humiliating me, while he sat there committing fraud and she sat there into a criminal. I sat back in my chair and I actually felt dizzy. This wasn't what I'd expected to find. I'd expected to find that Tom was maybe a little shady, maybe not as successful as he'd claimed. I hadn't expected this level of criminal activity. I hadn't expected that my daughter had married a man who was actually dangerous, actually a criminal. Carol said, "You could go to the authorities with this. They would probably want to know about it." "Yes," I said slowly, "I probably could. But I need to think about what that would mean for Sarah, for my relationship with her. If I turn him in, if this becomes public, if he ends up in prison, what does that do to her?" "It destroys her," Carol said matter-of-factly. "He's her husband. She's going to see it as a betrayal, even if he is guilty, even if he's been lying. To her this whole time. That's how these things work. The woman blames the person who exposes the crime instead of the person who committed it." I thought about that for a long time. She was right. Sarah would see my turning him in as me trying to sabotage her marriage, trying to prove that I was right all along about him not being good enough for her. She would see it as me making the choice to be right instead of the choice to be supportive. She would probably side with him even more firmly, and then I would lose her completely. I looked at Carol and I said, "I need to think about this. I need to figure out what I'm going to do with this information." She nodded, and she left the folder with me. I sat there with that folder for 3 days. I didn't open it after she left. I just sat looking at it, thinking about the weight of what I now knew. I kept imagining different scenarios. I could take this to the federal prosecutors, let them handle it. But then the case would become public. Sarah would read about it in the news. She'd see her husband's face in mugshots. She'd have to testify, possibly. Or I could stay quiet. Let Tom get caught on his own terms when his scheme inevitably collapsed. But how many other people would he hurt in the meantime? How much more money would he steal? How much deeper would Sarah get pulled into his criminal enterprise? The thing about having power is that you have to decide what to do with it. For my entire career, I'd made decisions every day. Decisions about business deals, decisions about people, decisions about strategy. I'd learned to make those decisions quickly, decisively, without second-guessing myself. But this was different. This wasn't about money or business. This was about my daughter, and no matter what I decided to do, it was going to hurt. If I did nothing, I would stay out of her life and she would stay married to a criminal. She might not even know what he was doing. He could drag her down with him when he eventually got caught, which he would. You can't commit fraud at this level forever without someone catching up with you. If I went to the authorities, I would be the one who turned him in, which would destroy my relationship with Sarah, possibly permanently. If I did something else, something in between, I still didn't know what that would be. There was another option, though, one that I started considering more seriously. I could present the evidence directly to Sarah. I could let her make the decision about what to do with it. I could give her the information and the power, and then let her choose her own path. The risk was that she would side with Tom. She would think I'd hired a private investigator to spy on them, that I was being controlling and manipulative, which was exactly what Tom had said about me all along. She might destroy the evidence. She might warn Tom and give him time to cover his tracks. She might cut me off completely. But there was also a chance, a small one, that if she saw the evidence, if she understood the scope of what Tom had done, she would finally understand that I wasn't the villain in this story. She would finally see that I'd been trying to protect her all along. So I sat with the information. I waited. I didn't go to the authorities yet. I didn't confront Tom. I just sat with the knowledge of what he'd done and thought about how to use it. I thought about the man who'd knocked me down at that dinner, who'd watched his wife laugh as I fell. I thought about the power he'd felt in that moment, the satisfaction he'd gotten from humiliating me. And I thought about how that power was about to disappear. And then Sarah called me, just like that. After 3 months of barely speaking to me, she called me on a Tuesday morning. Her voice sounded different. It sounded younger. It sounded scared. "Dad," she said, "I need to talk to you about something. I need to talk to you about Tom. I've been thinking about what you said, about all of it, and I think you were right all along." I was sitting at my desk when she said that, and I literally couldn't speak for a moment. I just held the phone to my ear and waited for her to keep going. "I've been looking at his emails," she said, "going through his phone. I think he's hiding something from me. And when I asked him about it, he got angry. He said I was betraying his trust. He said I was being exactly like you, suspicious and controlling. And that's when it hit me. That's when I realized he was lying to me about you too. That's when I realized everything he's been saying about you might be wrong." My hands started to shake. I had the folder right there on my desk. The entire investigation. Everything Carol had found. Everything that proved Tom was committing fraud, that he was a criminal, that he'd been manipulating both of us. I had power now. Real power. The kind that comes from knowing the truth and having the evidence to back it up. "Where are you right now?" I asked her. "I'm at work. I had a few minutes and I just needed to hear your voice." "I need to see you," I said. "Today if possible. Can you get away?" There was a pause and then she said, "Yeah, I can. I'll tell Tom I have an early meeting. Meet me at the coffee shop on 3rd Street, the one we used to go to. At 5 o'clock? Okay, Dad, I'll be there." She hung up and I sat there with that folder in my hands. I thought about what I was about to do. I was about to show my daughter evidence that her husband was a criminal. I was about to destroy her marriage, or at least force her to finally confront the truth about who she had married. But I was also about to save her. I was about to save her from being dragged down by his crimes, from being potentially implicated in his fraud, from years of lies and manipulation. I looked at the documentation one more time. Casino records, wire transfer receipts, screenshots of offshore bank accounts, tax documents, all of it adding up to a clear, undeniable picture of systematic fraud. I made a copy of everything. I put the originals in a safe place and I brought the copies with me to that coffee shop at 5 o'clock. Sarah was already there when I arrived. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying. She looked smaller than I remembered, like the weight of whatever she'd started to understand was physically pressing down on her. I ordered coffee for both of us, and I sat down across from her and I said, "Thank you for meeting me." "What's going on, Dad?" she asked. "I need you to look at something," I said, "and I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you, I did this because I love you, not to prove I was right, not to sabotage your marriage, but because I needed to know what was happening to you." I pulled out the folder and I slid it across the table toward her. Her hands were shaking as she opened it. As she looked at the first page, her face went pale. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's the truth," I said, "about Tom Abo, like what he's been doing, about why he's been saying those things about me. He doesn't believe any of it, Sarah. He was just trying to isolate you from me so I couldn't warn you about what he's really up to." She read through the document slowly. her eyes moving across the pages, her hands getting shakier with each one. By the time she got to the casino records, she was crying. She looked up at me and she said, "How long have you known about this?" "A few weeks," I said. "And why didn't you tell me immediately?" "Because I knew that if I did, you wouldn't believe me. You would have thought I was making it up to turn you against him. So I needed to be certain. I needed to have evidence so clear that there was no way you could deny it. And here it is." She put the folder down and she covered her face with her hands and she just sobbed. People around us in the coffee shop were starting to stare, but I didn't care. My daughter was finally seeing the truth, and it was breaking her heart. I reached across the table and I grabbed her hand. "Sarah," I said, "look at me." She lifted her tear-stained face and met my eyes. "None of this is your fault. Do you understand me? You didn't know. He lied to you. He manipulated you. He used you to get to me because he was desperate. But this isn't on you." She shook her head and said, "I laughed at you, Dad. At dinner. When he pushed you, I participated. I was so horrible to you and he was a criminal the whole time. I was wrong. I was so completely wrong about everything." I pulled my chair around the table so I was sitting right next to her instead of across from her, and I said, "We're going to figure this out together. You're not going to go through this alone. He's going to face consequences for what he's done. The authorities need to know about this. You need to talk to a lawyer about what this means for you, about whether you were involved in any of it without knowing. But I promise you, you're not going to lose me again. I'm here. I'm right here." She leaned against me and she cried. I thought about the fall at dinner, Tom's foot coming out from under the table, Sarah's laugh and the humiliation that followed. I thought about how I'd turned all of it into information I could use, and I realized that this moment, with my daughter finally seeing the truth and willing to hear me, was worth every moment of that suffering. This was the revenge I'd wanted. Not Tom going to prison, not the public humiliation, just this. My daughter coming back to me, being believed, being right about something I desperately needed to be right about. The phone call had changed everything. That same afternoon I made the first call. Sarah was with me, still processing everything, and I told her to stay quiet while I dialed. The number was for a federal prosecutor I'd worked with years ago on an investigation that had gone nowhere at the time, but I remembered his name. I remembered that he understood fraud, that he understood the kinds of crimes that required patience and evidence to prosecute properly. His secretary put me through immediately when I gave my name. We'd worked together on a case back in the 90s, and he seemed genuinely happy to hear from me. But my voice was different when I told him why I was calling. I said, "I need to report a federal crime. I have extensive documentation of ongoing fraud, tax evasion, and Ponzi scheme elements. The perpetrator has victimized multiple investors, including family members. There's evidence of offshore accounts, false tax filings, and embezzlement." The prosecutor's tone shifted immediately. I could hear it in his voice, the shift from casual greeting to professional attention. He said, "Tell me more." So I did. I told him about Tom's business structure, about the shell companies, about the false projections and the misrepresented assets. I told him about the casino records, the gambling addiction, the loans taken against business collateral and never repaid. I told him about the investors who'd been approached with unrealistic promises and hadn't received returns. I told him about the way Tom had systematized his fraud, made it look legitimate through careful documentation and professional presentation. The prosecutor listened without interrupting, which was good because it meant he understood how serious this was, how significant the scope of the operation. When I finished, he said, "Do you have copies of the documentation?" "Yes," I said. "I can have them to you within the hour. And the victims, are they willing to cooperate?" "That's complicated," I told him. "My daughter is his wife. She married him without knowing what he was doing. But yes, I believe she'll cooperate. Other victims may not. They might be embarrassed, or they might not realize they've been defrauded. We'll need to reach out to them individually." The prosecutor said, "I'm going to have some agents come talk to you. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon, very soon. What you're describing, if the documentation backs it up, is significant. This could go federal." "I understand," I said. "What do you need from me?" "Everything. Every single document, every email, every bank statement, every screenshot. Build a timeline, cross-reference everything. If you're willing to do that kind of work, it makes our job substantially easier." I said, "I'll do better than that. I'll hand it all to you organized and indexed." The prosecutor laughed slightly. "You are in law enforcement. You know how to build a case." "Yes," I said, "I do." We hung up and I looked at Sarah. She was sitting on my office couch, pale, her hands shaking slightly. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we organize everything," I said. "We make sure every piece of documentation is clear, dated, cross-referenced. We build a case that's so comprehensive and so undeniable that Tom has no way to talk his way out of it." "How long will that take?" she asked. I shrugged. "Days at least, maybe a week. Then it goes to federal prosecutors and they decide whether to pursue charges. That could take months. In the meantime, he goes about his life not knowing that we've already ended it." "What should I do?" Sarah asked. "Should I confront him?" "No," I said firmly. "You don't tell him anything. You act normal. You let him think everything is fine. The moment he knows we're building a case against him, he'll run. He'll delete evidence. He'll move money around. He might even try to disappear. We need him to stay right where he is, comfortable in his confidence that he's gotten away with this." "So you want me to lie to him?" she asked quietly. "I want you to survive what comes next," I said. "And there, T means not giving him any warning." She nodded, but I could see the weight of it settling on her shoulders. I'd just asked my daughter to betray her husband, to sit across from him at dinner knowing what we knew, to pretend everything was normal while the walls closed in on him. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't clean, but it was necessary. That night, I worked. I worked for 6 straight hours, organizing every piece of documentation Carol had gathered. I built a timeline starting from the first questionable business transaction and continuing through to the most recent ones. I cross-referenced names with dates, with amounts. I created a spreadsheet that showed which investors had been contacted, how much they'd been promised, what actually happened to their money. I noted the casinos, the dates of visits, the amounts wagered and lost. I built a visual case, the kind that a jury would understand without needing to be an accountant or a fraud expert. By midnight, I had everything ready to go. I printed it all out, 3 complete sets. One for the prosecutor's office, one for the FBI field office, and one I kept as a backup. I looked at what I'd created and I thought about Tom, going about his normal life, completely unaware that his entire world was about to collapse. The beauty of doing this properly, of building the case methodically and carefully, was that he wouldn't see it coming. He'd wake up one morning to federal agents at his door, and by then it would be too late. By then there would be nothing he could do to stop it. The dominoes were already falling. He just didn't know. UIT yet. The next week was strange. Sarah went back to her normal life, but it wasn't normal anymore. She went to work, came home, talked to Tom about his day. She didn't tell him about our coffee shop meeting, about the investigation, about the evidence that was now in the hands of federal prosecutors. She was living a double life, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. She called me every evening just to talk, just to hear that what we were doing was right. I told her it was. I believed it was. But I could also feel the weight of it. What we were doing was going to destroy her marriage, even if it was the right thing to do. What we were doing was going to paint her as a betrayer in the eyes of people who didn't understand. Some people would think she'd turned him in out of spite, out of betrayal. Others would think she was complicit all along. The truth was more complicated than either of those narratives, but truth often is. She told me about sitting across from Tom at dinner, watching him eat, listening to him talk about his day, about a meeting with a potential investor, about a business opportunity and development that never existed. She told me that every word felt like a lie now, even the ones that weren't. She told me that she couldn't look at him without thinking about the offshore accounts, the fake financial statements, the way he'd used her love against her, made her complicit through ignorance. She told me that she'd gone to the bathroom during dinner one night and just locked the door and cried for 10 minutes before composing herself enough to come back out. And Tom had been there, asking what was wrong, and she'd said she wasn't feeling well, and he'd accepted that without question. He had no idea. 4 days after my call to the prosecutor, there was a knock on my office door. 2 men in dark suits, federal agents. They introduced themselves, showed me their credentials, and asked if we could talk somewhere private. I took them to a conference room and we sat down. They had questions about Tom, about his business practices, about the investors. They wanted to know details that only someone close to him would know. I answered what I could. They took notes. They assured me that this was being treated as a significant fraud investigation and that they had people already working on it. They told me that they'd reached out to some of the other Tims, and that several of them were willing to cooperate. They told me that a search warrant was being prepared and that they would be executing it within the next 72 hours. Within 72 hours, Tom's office would be raided, his computers would be seized, his files would be gone through with a microscope. Everything he'd tried to hide would be found. The agents were professional, efficient, and completely unmoved by the scope of what Tom had done. To them, this was just another fraud case. To me, it was the end of my daughter's marriage. I asked them if I should warn Sarah. They said no. They said that warning him through her would compromise the investigation. They said I needed to let this play out naturally. They said Tom needed to be shocked, surprised, unable to prepare a defense. So I went home that night and I didn't tell Sarah that the raid was coming. I let her come to my house for dinner not knowing that her husband was about to be arrested. We sat at my kitchen table and she pushed food around on her plate and said, "How much longer do you think this is going to take?" "I don't know," I said, "but soon. Within days, probably." She nodded and she said, "I'm terrified." "Of what?" "Of what happens to him. Of what happens to me. Of what happens to us. I want him to face consequences, but I also don't want my life to explode." "But it's going to explode anyway," she said. "Once this becomes public, once people know what he did, everyone's going to judge me. They're going to think I was part of it. They're going to think I knew and didn't say anything. Maybe they'll think I was helping him the whole time." I reached across the table and grabbed her hand. "You did the right thing," I said. "That's all that matters. You did the right thing and you did it for the right reasons. The rest will sort itself out." But she didn't look convinced. She looked like someone who understood that their life was about to change in fundamental ways, and she was terrified of what came next. She looked like she was grieving, which I suppose she was, in a way. She was grieving the marriage she thought she had, the man she thought she'd married, the life she thought they were building together. On the 3rd day, the raid happened. I wasn't there. Sarah called me in the afternoon, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her. She said, "They came to his office. Federal agents. They had a warrant. They took his computers, his files, everything. He's here. He's home now. He's in the study. He's been on the phone with a lawyer for the last hour. I'm terrified he's going to figure out that I told you something. I'm terrified he's going to put the pieces together and realize it was me." I said, "Calm down. He won't figure it out. He's panicked right now. He's thinking about himself, not about you." "Did he say anything to you?" "He asked me if I knew anything about it," she said. I said no. I said I was shocked. I acted like I had no idea what was happening. "Good," I said. "Keep doing. Fuck that. Don't show him that you know anything. Let him think you're on his side, or at least neutral. If he confides in you, if he says things, you tell me." "I know this is hard," I said, "but we're almost through this. Once he's officially charged, once this becomes a legal matter, some of the pressure is going to ease. It's going to get worse before it gets better, but it will get better." She hung up, and I sat with my phone in my hand, thinking about Tom in his study, probably on the phone with a criminal defense attorney, probably realizing that his house of cards had just collapsed. The raid had been the catalyst, the thing that tipped him from confident fraud perpetrator into panicked criminal. He was going to make mistakes now. People always do when they're panicked. They act irrational, lie. They destroy evidence, they try to run. The smart ones get caught trying to flee. The desperate ones turn on people they love. I wondered which kind Tom would be. I didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, Sarah called again. This time she wasn't crying. This time her voice was different. Harder. She said, "He left. Early this morning. He packed a bag and left. He didn't say where he was going. He just said he needed to clear his head." "He's probably on the road right now," I said, "heading somewhere, or trying to. The FBI will have a flag on his name. They'll catch him at an airport, at a border crossing somewhere. He can't get far." "I know," she said, "but I don't know if I feel better or worse about that. On one hand, I'm angry. On the other hand, I'm still his wife. Some T of me is still worried about him." "That's your heart," I said. "It's a good one. It's getting you into trouble, but it's a good one. But this isn't about your heart anymore. This is about justice. This is about protecting other people from what he's done to you and to them." 2 days later, I got the call. Sarah was sobbing on the other end of the line. Tom had been arrested at a hotel in Minneapolis. Federal agents had found him checking in under a false name, probably thinking he could disappear for a while, regroup, figure out his next move. But the moment he'd used a credit card, he'd given himself away. Federal agents had come to his hotel room at 6 in the morning. They'd read him his rights. They'd put him in handcuffs. They'd taken him away in front of the hotel staff and the other guests who were checking out for their days. She'd heard about it from a friend who'd seen it on the news. Not from him. He'd never called. He'd been arrested and he'd never called his wife. "She's in custody," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "They're holding him for a bail hearing tomorrow. His lawyer called me. He's saying bail is going to be substantial. They're saying he's a flight risk because of the offshore accounts and because he tried to run." I said, "That's good. That means they have strong evidence. That means they're confident in their case." But Sarah wasn't thinking about the strength of the case. She was thinking about the fact that her husband was in a holding cell, and that she'd been the one who'd put him there, even if indirectly. She was thinking about what this meant for her life, for their house, for their marriage that was now officially over. I told her to come to my place. I told her I'd order food and we'd sit and we'd process this together. But what I was really thinking about was the moment at that dinner when Tom had tripped me, when Sarah had laughed, when I'd felt the humiliation burning through me. I was thinking about how that moment had led to this moment, how the pain had led to clarity, and the clarity had led to action, and the action had led to justice. Not the kind of justice that erases the humiliation. Nothing could do that. But the kind that makes sense of it. The kind that transforms pain into purpose. When she arrived at my house, she looked hollowed out, like she'd been scooped clean from the inside. We sat in my living room and she told me details I didn't need to know. She told me about how nice the hotel was, about how he'd probably been thinking he could hide there for a while, maybe try to negotiate from a position where he could claim he just needed space. She told me about how the arrest, T, had been humiliating for her, how her friends had called her, how her mother had asked what was going on, how she'd had to explain that her husband of 5 years was a federal criminal. She told me about how she'd called in sick to work and how her boss had asked if everything was okay, and how she'd said yes, everything was fine, just a personal thing, and how that lie had felt worse than all the other lies because it was her lie, not his. I listened. I didn't have much to say. What could you say? I just listened and let her talk and let her cry and let her grieve the life she thought she was going to have. The newspapers picked up the story within hours. The headline was something like "Local developer arrested in federal fraud scheme." But what really mattered was the information underneath. They reported on the shell companies, the false projections, the victims. They mentioned that one victim was a family member, and people started putting the pieces together. People knew who I was. People knew who Sarah was. People started asking questions. I got calls from business associates asking if I was okay, if Sarah was okay, if there was anything they could do. Some of those calls felt genuine. Others felt like they were just fishing for information, trying to figure out if I'd been involved in Tom's schemes, if there was any way this could reflect badly on me. Sarah got calls from friends who are shocked, horrified, sympathetic. Some people cut off contact entirely. That's the thing about scandal in a small business community. News travels fast and judgment follows faster. There's a perception that if you're close to a criminal, you might be complicit somehow. That guilt by association is real, even when it shouldn't be. But what I noticed was that the people who mattered, who really knew me and who really knew Sarah, they were supportive. They were angry at Tom. They were sympathetic to what we'd gone through. They were on our side. The ones who judged us harshly were the ones who didn't matter anyway. The ones who'd always been on the periphery of my life, who'd never really known us at all. And Sarah, she found something unexpected in the aftermath. She found people who'd also been victimised by Tom. Investors who'd approached her after the news broke, thanking her for doing something about it. People who'd lost their savings, who'd been devastated, who thought they'd never get justice. And now they had it. Not because I'd turned him in out of revenge, though that was part of it, but because Sarah had been brave enough to listen to her father, to consider the possibility that she'd been deceived, to participate in the process of bringing the truth to light. That mattered to people. One woman, a retirement-age investor named Catherine, came up to Sarah at a coffee shop a week after Tom's arrest. She had tears in her eyes. She said, "Thank you. Thank you for having the courage to do this. I'd given him everything, my life savings, and I thought it was just gone. I thought I'd never see it again. But now there's hope. There's going to be a restitution process. There's going to be justice." Sarah had cried. Not because Catherine had thanked her, but because she realised that in trying to protect herself, in choosing to side with the truth instead of her husband, she'd actually done something good. She'd helped people. She'd made a difference. And that shifted something for her. It made what she'd done feel less like a betrayal and more like the right choice. Tom's bail hearing was contentious. His lawyer, some expensive criminal defence attorney Tom had managed to hire before he was locked up, argued that he had ties to the community, that he had family obligations, that he wasn't a flight risk. The prosecutor countered by mentioning his attempt to flee, the hotel under a false name, the offshore accounts, the pattern of behaviour that indicated a man willing to run rather than face consequences. The judge sided with the prosecutor. Bail was set at $500,000. Tom didn't have that kind of money available without liquidating assets that were now frozen as part of the investigation. He stayed in custody. I watched Sarah watch the bail hearing video that was posted online. She didn't say anything while it played. Her face was blank. Ank. And when it ended, she just closed the laptop and walked out of the room. The trial would take months. Maybe longer. There would be discovery, motions, depositions. Sarah would have to testify. She'd have to explain her role, her decision to cooperate with the investigation, the things Tom had said to her, the lies he'd told. Some people would call that betrayal, but she'd made peace with it. She'd decided that standing with the truth was more important than standing with her husband, and that decision had given her something she hadn't had in a long time: peace, real peace. I thought about what I'd said to Sarah that first day in the coffee shop, when I'd shown her the evidence. I'd said that the truth mattered, that doing the right thing was what separated us from people like Tom. It'd said that she wasn't responsible for his crimes, only for her own response to the knowledge of those crimes. She'd chosen to respond. She'd chosen truth over loyalty to a husband who didn't deserve loyalty. She'd chosen me over him, not out of spite, but out of love. That's what had changed everything. Not my investigation, not my triumph at finally being right, but her decision, her choice, her courage. The call that had changed everything wasn't the one I made to the prosecutor. It wasn't about legal strategy or federal charges or the machinery of justice. It was the one Sarah made to me that Tuesday morning when she finally understood that her father had been right all along. That one call was when everything shifted. That call was when the dominoes really started falling, and Tom, wherever he was in federal custody, probably didn't even know that it had started with his wife. Her hands shaking as she told me she'd been looking at his emails, finally seeing the truth I'd been trying to show her all along. One call. That's all it took. One call to transform humiliation into vindication. One call to turn a daughter away from her husband and back toward her father. One call to set the ente for a machinery of justice in motion. I think about that moment sometimes. That moment when she called and said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about Tom. I need to talk to you about something." I think about how different everything could have been if she'd never made that call. I could have sat with the knowledge, let Tom get caught eventually on his own terms, watched him destroy more lives before someone finally stopped him. Or I could have done what I did, which was turn the pain and humiliation into something useful. But neither of those outcomes would have mattered if Sarah hadn't picked up her phone and decided to trust me. That call was the pivot point. That was the moment when one daughter chose her father, when one person chose truth over comfort, when one act of courage started a chain reaction that led to justice. One call had changed everything for all of us. And what I realised sitting in my living room with Sarah while the media descended and Tom faced federal charges and victims started getting their lives back was that I hadn't won because I was smart or because I'd hired a private investigator or because I'd known how to build a case. I'd won because my daughter finally trusted me. That was the real victory. Everything else was just consequences.